Go. All right.
I'm just seeing K on the screen.
Same. I think she's just is hiding herself so that she won't be spotlighted, which I don't think she will anyway, because Ward and Jacob sort of cover all of that, like who's shown and who's not. So
We're live. Go ahead and play it when it started.
okay.
Can you get the recording thing off there?
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm very pleased to introduce Meredith Monk. Meredith Monk's unique contributions to the field of composition, combined with her approach in creating novel works of interdisciplinary performance, make her one of the most influential artists of our time. Her approach pushes the traditional boundaries of music, composition, art, and theatrical performance, and has paved the way for artists of many disciplines to explore creative risk. Meredith Monk's over 55-year compositional legacy illustrates how success is carved from creativity, perseverance, and risk. Exposed to music and dance at an early age, she participated in a Dalcroze eurythmics class to improve her physical coordination. Ms. Monk's initial training in dance at Sarah Lawrence University helped her explore composition and new vocal techniques, such as throat singing, yodeling, and microtonality. And that began when she joined the Judson Church Ensemble in 1964. She eventually founded her own company, the House Foundation for the Arts, in 1968. The foundation, which still operates today, is dedicated to promoting the performance of interdisciplinary composition. Meredith Monk is the recipient of several of the most significant artistic achievements, including the prestigious MacArthur Genius Award, 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, appointment to the 2014-2015 Richard and Barbara Debs Composers Chair at Carnegie Hall, the 2017 Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize, and the 2015 National Medal of Honor presented by President Barack Obama. To have received just one of these accolades in a lifetime would have been quite an achievement. To receive all of them reflects her genius, perseverance, and willingness to engage in creative risk. Meredith, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in a fairly recent interview, I just saw this, you gave some examples of things that you're inspired by. And 2 things really stuck out to me. Pharrell's Happy and Soup. So I'm curious, in general.
Oh, and Soup.
Soup, yeah. So in general, I'm curious how the pandemic has affected your inspiration and process, but specifically, can you tell us more about Soup?
Yes, I think I've made more soup during the pandemic. It's the best thing to do. What I like about soup, making soup, and I use soup as a metaphor in my creative process as well. What I like about making soup is that you never know how it's going to come out, because I just throw in what I have, whatever vegetables I have, and then spices, and each time it's different, and so it's exciting. It's sort of a discovery each time. So that's what I like about making soup. Plus, it makes life very easy to have something that you can draw upon to eat over the days. But I use the metaphor of soup for the way that I work, because I think what I do is I really try to find my I work very hard to discover my ingredients. So in musical terms, that would be the material, the phrases, the little fragments, little forms. And then I leave the carrots be carrots for a while. I leave the celery to be celery. Each of those ingredients, I let it just be for a while. And then I start little by little simmering the soup. And it starts boiling down and boiling down and boiling down. And at a certain point, I know it's the time to start that process of simmering. And at a certain point, I also know that it has boiled down to the essence of what the form is. So, it's a metaphor that I use a lot when I'm talking about making something.
And so I'm grateful for this takeaway, because I'm fairly soup averse, or I should say, I'm averse to making soup, because it seems intimidating to me. But the way you just, am I the only one?
Throw it all in there. You just cut up vegetables, throw it into a pot. This last one I made, I tried a little bit of some old lentil dal, but little tiny little lentils that is usually, it's just keep trying things. Chinese mushrooms I put in the last one, and then some kind of broth, or it could be water, and then throw in any kind of spice that tickles your fancy.
I love this.
It's actually the least intimidating cooking that I can think of.
Well, I think I get intimidated as I approach the stove, just in general.
Oh, you just throw it in, and then you boil it first, and then you let it simmer for as long as you want.
But what a lovely metaphor for working in the arts as well. I like that the idea of assembling your ingredients, and then particularly what you said about letting them be what they're going to be.
Well, you let them be what they are to start out with. You don't transform them to start out with, because you want them to have their own integrity, and you want to find out about them. You want to find out all the possibilities of those ingredients. And then as it starts simmering down, then you start feeling the form coming in. And so it's a very organic process.
I love that.
Yeah.
And what about Pharrell's Happy?
That piece, I just think it's the most wonderful piece to dance to, when you're feeling blue. It's just every chorus, I just like, yay! It just is a wonderful dance piece. Another one that I could pass on to you that I've been loving listening to, one of my really favorite singers, and who happens to be also now a friend of mine over the years, Caetano Veloso, who's a great Brazilian singer.
Yeah.
And he actually did a cover of a song of mine, which was really beautiful. But he and Gilberto Gil wrote a song called 9 out of 10. They wrote it, I think, in the early 70s, when they were in exile from Brazil, because, it was a dictatorship. They were imprisoned because they were very counter the government, and they were both poets and musicians and very well known. And so the government thought that they were too dangerous. So that first they put them in prison, and then there were so many protests that they sent them away, and they sent them to London. And the song is about being in exile and trying to make do with that. And I just thought, in this time, it's given me a lot of courage, because it's about how do we, in very difficult times, remain resilient and creative. It's a very beautiful song. I highly recommend it. It's called 9 out of 10. I'm
going to check it out.
Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil.
I look forward to that. You already kind of touched on it a little bit, and also on Tuesday, but can you get into how this pandemic has affected your own process and your own inspiration? Well,
it's been very challenging, because I've been working on Indra's Net, which is going to be a large, maybe one of my largest works, performance installation piece. And I've been thinking about it for 10 years. I've been probably working on music for about the last 5. But we had just started rehearsal. I was teaching at Harvard in the composition department, music department, and just as a guest professor, with Katie Geisinger assisting me. And Harvard gave my group a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to work in a place called Art Lab, which is a whole building, like an empty building with 2 beautiful spaces in it. And So my 8 singers were up there in residence, and we had a week, very intensive week of really starting to rehearse a piece. And it was so, it was just so inspiring and so magnificent to be there with them. And then the next week, everything shut down. So that's been very hard, because I think that Indra's Net is so much about space. It's really a piece about space, and space is so integral to the music and even my musical thinking. I'm thinking antiphonally, or where the instruments would be all over the space and how the audience would be walking through. I mean, it's really involved with that, maybe more than almost anything I've ever done musically. So what to do? So what we've been doing is we've been working on section by section, making Zoom and Jamulus recordings of the music, and now I'm also working on a section of it that will also have images that are not like Zoom images, but really more like making a film. So the first part that I worked on was called Anthem, and Alan Pearson from Alarm Rule Sound got in touch with me around the beginning of the pandemic, and he said, would you write a piece for us, because we're trying to figure out how can we play. And I said, I cannot write a new piece. I'm so involved and immersed in Indra's Net, but let me see if there's any material that would work for something like this. And it turned out that Anthem is a piece that has built-in delays already scored in there. It was, it's the strangest thing. Like I wanted that feeling of these time delays within the piece. And so I said, let's try working on that. So we had a wonderful time working on it. And it gave me the opportunity to really finish the form of that section. And now we're working on another section called Rotation. But, the thing that's hard about it is that I don't usually work this way. Sometimes I'll work on a piece of music, period, from beginning to end, but with no other elements. But in a piece like this, the elements are so woven together, and it's so hard to not be in the same room. In a way, I feel like I sculpt the work, with live human beings there. So it's more, okay, I'm working on one section and it's scored out, and the next section it's scored out, and the next section it's scored out. And I'm doing that just to keep the process going. And on one level, it's very satisfying to be continuing with the process, but on another level, especially with the vocal material, the piece has these different realms in terms of instrumentation and kind of, I would say, also visually. And one realm is, I would call the earth realm, and that's a lot of a cappella vocal pieces. And I really don't want to put them onto score form and hand them to my singers. I just don't want to work that way. It's not the way that I work with them. And so, it's just slowed everything down.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm just so happy to be working at all. It's miraculous, that we have been able to work.
Well, on Tuesday's talk with Rob Keir, he mentioned words like organic, ritual, and ceremony to describe your work. I think when I think about your work, one of the first things that comes to mind is creative risk, apropos of today's talk. And I suppose the reason I do is I think about a lot of the vocal pieces, the extended techniques that you employ, but also this powerful interdisciplinary ethic, unrelenting interdisciplinary ethic, and it's sort of surprising. Not really, but there's part of me that thinks, oh, if anyone can deal with this crazy situation that we have, it's you. And I wonder how you think about space as related to this virtual space that we're in.
Well, do you want to talk about that, or would you like to start with risk, or would you like to talk about perceptual modalities?
So let's start with
There's 3 questions in there.
Yeah, you'll get used to that in this hour.
I don't mind, but I just want to know what you like to start with, because my mind was going like the first 2 questions, and then you laid a third whammy on there.
So let me break it down. Let's start with space, because you were talking about that a second ago. you like to work in space. Space is
Yes.
integral to your work. Have you gotten to the place where you start to see this virtual world as space itself?
Not yet.
Mhm.
You know, I feel like we're missing touch, you know, and I feel like we're missing touch in our society. So, you know, that's what I love about live performance is it's tactile.
Mm.
It's really tactile. And I was thinking so much in terms of, for example, I could give you an example if that's helpful. I on this rotation piece, um, you know, that I'm working on now and trying to find images. It will be a video, and I'm trying to get away from the Zoom look and the
Mm.
seeing people play. I mean, it's really other images as if I were making film.
Mm-hmm.
That will be a counterpoint to the music. But in the piece, what I was thinking of was I wanted to make the piece in a really large place, like an armory or, you know, railroad station or something like that. And the audience would be on two sides. And we would be doing this procession that, as we're singing this piece, that would just go all the way around the perimeter of the space. So sometimes the audience would hear the voices coming very, very, very close. And sometimes they would get further away. And then all the instrumentalists, so there will be probably 16 instrumentalists, and they're playing, but they're also rotating, but all together. So, you know, the whole thing is rotating in the same way. And so as if the whole space is kind of spinning. So again, this tactility of being able to work close and far. And then I also, you know, the live performance, you know, it's just an opportunity for us to exchange real energy, you know, the real energy of transmission of energy, and also our vulnerability, our humanness. And so that, you know, I haven't seen anything quite like that on the screen, although I've seen wonderful things. And, you know, I love that people are working, and I've cried with some of them that are very moving, but I do miss that, you know, the texture.
Mm-hmm.
And when we've been working on the jam list, I remember the one rehearsal of Anthem where Alan Pearson said, you know, because this was a premiere for me. So the premiere of the section of Indra's Net was on Zoom. I'm like, oh, great. All right. So, so I'm hearing, I think there were 16 players from Alarm Will Sound, and there were 4 singers. So I'm hearing everything in my earphones, and he's saying, do you have any corrections or comments to make about this? I was like, Alan, I'm just trying to hear it all. It's like just coming in like, you know, like into these earphones with no space. But then what we did was, in the mix with our wonderful engineer, Daniel Newman, we worked really hard to create. So, you know, what we have to do now is we have to create space in the aftermath. You know, it's really creating space as much as we can. And so we sculpted the piece. So you do get the sense of a 3-dimensional reality, at least in sound.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Oh yeah. And I always say that, and I think I said this on Tuesday as well, you know, I think space is our great ally as performers. Sound goes into space. The sound waves go into space.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you describe almost a responsibility to create space, especially right now.
Yeah,
I feel that as well. So let's talk about the interdisciplinarity part.
Interdisciplinarity, that's a great word. Like
Yeah, well, the interdiscipline nature, or the interdisciplinary work, this ethic that you have, where did it come from? I know you started as a dancer.
I didn't. I started as a musician and a dancer.
Okay.
There were a few little things, facts that were may I correct some of that, or is that?
Yeah, please.
Rude?
Oh no.
Okay. Well, I actually started both in music and dance as a child. So I played piano all the way through my childhood, and my mother was a singer. So those were pretty hand in hand in my childhood, and also with theater as well. And then at Sarah Lawrence, I was in both the voice department. So I was singing leader, and I was singing opera workshop, and, you know, doing recitals and everything, and as well as the dance department, as well as doing pretty simple piano compositions and dance compositions, and also working a bit in theater. So at Sarah Lawrence, I had glimpses of how to try to integrate these things together. And it seemed really important to me for my own, my own expression of wholeness as a human being. But early on coming into New York and continuing with that way of working, I realized that we're human beings that have multi-perceptual mechanisms. To me, it's an affirmation of the richness of our human experience. We have eyes, we have ears, we have mouths, we have noses, we have hands, we have sense of kinetic, sensory mechanisms. So I just felt we're spiritual people, we're intellectual people. There's shades of feeling that we experience. So how to make work that reflects the fullness of human experience. I think that's the ethics that you're talking about.
Yeah. And somehow.
And, also, I was not a member of the Judson Dance Theater. That's also a misnomer that a number of people, I think a number of people, it's a misunderstanding. I came in to New York, which was a wonderful time to come to New York, where there were a lot of artists from different mediums trying to break through the boundaries of their individual art forms, which was something that I had already glimpsed at Sarah Lawrence. So for me, it was a real affirmation of my glimpses and what I was feeling and what I was needing to find. And but the Judson Dance Theater, by the time I got to New York as an entity, had ended. So I did make some pieces in the Judson Church, because that was a wonderful performing space for everybody, for musicians, for dancers, for playwrights, poets. But I wasn't really a member of the Judson Dance Theater. Okay,
good.
Yeah.
So let's talk about creative risk, the third part to my jumbled question before. In some ways, I think when I think about all of your work, I think creative risk. But can you speak to the creative risks that you've taken with Indra's Net in particular?
Well, first of all, in a general sense, I think risk is what it's about. I think that finding something new, at least for me or for anyone who's looking, that's something that's very exciting. It's a life of discovery. And, I think that the risk part of it is the way that you break through your habitual patterns and behavior. So, from time to time, for example, the late 90s, I was getting, I felt that the music was developing, because the music is the river of my life. That's my source, and I work on that all the time. But I felt that I was getting kind of bored with my own visual ideas. And so I decided to try to find a visual artist, which I had never done before, because I usually make all the elements myself. I wanted to try to find visual artists that I could really work with and, really refresh, in the sense you could say. And so I found Ann Hamilton, who's a magnificent installation artist and sculptor. And she had said that she had been quite influenced by my work in her early years. So we had a wonderful dialogue, and that was a way to open back out from my own ways of doing things. And I think that that's what I try to do through my life, is to, as much as I can, start from zero and not have anything of the backpack of my past or what I usually do to begin. That's what I try to do as much as I can. And, of course, we do carry it nevertheless, but, I try very hard. And in the Zen Buddhist tradition, there's Suzuki Roshi said, there's a book called Beginner's Mind.
Right.
He talks about beginner's mind, Zen mind, beginner's mind. So beginner's mind is that you come to working on something with no assumptions, no expectations, and as fresh as possible. And so, I'm not going to say that risking is not terrifying. It's terrifying every single time, but I think that stepping to the edge of the cliff is something that, at least for me, is what makes it very exciting, because when I get the first little clue of the detective story, I feel like I'm finding something, discovering something I haven't heard before, that I haven't done before. And that, I think that keeps you young and interested and excited.
The other side of that might be that when you get to that cliff and you're, well, let me just speak for myself here. When I sometimes get to that cliff, I resent the cliff. I resent that I'm there. I mean, let's just say, like in the pandemic, it's forced us to kind of create in new ways. It's this Zoom land is annoying at best.
Yeah.
I feel some sort of resentment to this new world.
Yeah.
And then still, some projects have kind of come out of this that I look back on and I think, oh, I guess I was kind of in a beginner's mind in a way, but I was kind of like a teething toddler or something, like, angry about that I had to be in this particular moment.
I understand that, very well. We all have to work with that, because the resistance actually takes more energy than doing it. And I have some days that I've had enough of this, but the other side of it is that it's strangely enough for me in terms of Indra's Net, in terms of the thinking, because you have to be so imaginative, like, how can I make this piece come to life? And it may not come out the way that I had thought it was going to in the first place, all the years that I worked on it. I just want it to come to life, however it needs to come to life. So I'm going to try to follow this. And I feel like my thinking in some ways I've spiraled back to some of my early way of thinking about like site-specific work and being more daring in terms of time, in terms of structure. I don't know if that it will ever come to fruition. I mean, but at least in terms of my thinking, it does in a strange way allow you to be very resourceful. You have to be resourceful to figure out, how do I keep this entity alive? And I might have to find different ways. So, it's got both sides, but I really understand how you feel. I really do.
Thank you. It's
I
stressful.
really do. Some days are better than others. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Do you see creative risk kind of being born out of problem solving, or more out of sort of just pure innovation and creativity?
I think those two things they go hand in hand. I don't think there's any separation. Because I think the first impulse, a lot of, at least what I do, is my material comes very intuitively. And I think part of my process a lot is listening, listening inside, I don't mean necessarily literal listening, but listening. What does this piece need? What is the world of this piece? Because each piece is, to me, a different world. And that's another thing about the beginner's mind, is that if you think of each piece as its own world, then that means you don't really know anything about that world when you start. And you're asking, and I talk to it, I mean, in my mind, like, what do you need? What are the principles and laws of this world? And then I try to stay within those principles and laws of the world that are set up by that world. On the other hand, I think that part of the process that's the other side of it is, you start by thinking that, and then even that is a conceptual kind of framework, and that can change. So it's a matter of not staying too rigid with that as well. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. And you're making me...
You're trying to fit yourself like into this concept thing that you have. It never works. So, life is messier. And so, you just have to follow it. It's kind of like following it, and just trying to be open.
You're making me hungry for soup. It reminds me of the conversation with soup anyway. And along
but the other part of the process is the other side, which is that once that material has been found, the material, and I don't know how soupy this is. This is quite a different, we have to find a different metaphor. The other part is the rigor, the absolute rigor of making the form inevitable.
Manifestation.
That's a very, very different process, so that's like a lot of work, a lot of thinking, it's just a different aspect, a lot of pulling the lens back to see the whole.
Yeah.
I always say to my students, you might have a piece of material that you love, that's the most beautiful thing you ever heard, and if it doesn't work in the piece, you have to throw it away.
Right.
So it's that more the overview kind of part of it, and then perfecting it as much as one can perfect it, and being very meticulous about it, which is very different than the part where the material is coming. That's very intuitive, and in a way, at least I try to keep myself as free as possible. I don't know if that's the same with you, but
I try. I certainly aspire to that. But I also notice a closing down. But it's a push and pull. But along this line, and I admire how you're talking about this. There's a question that's relevant here from one of the attendees here. This is Daniel Daly. Says, very curious about the simmering component of your creative process. What kind of activities, processes do you engage in to discover the work's essence?
I would say the simmering process for me is the rehearsal process. So I would say the keeping the materials in their own integrity is more the long time that I work alone. So, you know, that's it could be years, it could be months before I start rehearsing.
Right.
And the simmering process is the rehearsing, because that's where I'm able to see how it manifests in real human beings, and you know, and then being able to change and let it morph into what it needs to be, and seeing different possibilities and, you know, different forms. That's the rehearsal process. And then it's somehow at a certain point, it seems to, and I find in these last year, I would say the last 10 or 15 years, more than I ever realized as a younger artist, there seems to be this magic point where there's some kind of entity makes itself known. And then that's the time where the form really starts boiling down to its essence. But I think the simmering process is the rehearsing process, is the trying everything process, trying all possibilities within this material.
I've got to push on this because this is really interesting to me. The rehearsal process you talk about really seems more common in dance than in music. We were talking earlier before this talk started about new music nerds, which I certainly am a part of. But in that world, there's a kind of value to bringing a piece solidly to the performer's stand, having it done, having it kind of like fixed, and let's play, and then just get it right from the page. I'm assuming you must have
been in that.
I totally get that, and I'm assuming that you must have. Oh no, I really value your ethic here, but I'm assuming that there must have been some stresses on you to bring that process to certain musicians or other performing artists.
Usually if I have a chance to work with a group for a while, we have such a wonderful time. For them, it is such a relief, because you get the music into the bones. It's a very different process than seeing something in the page and you read it down, and then another day, another dollar, you read the next thing down. First of all, you don't listen in the same way. And the experience is so different of playing it. So, you know, I really admire the new music nerd groups that memorize everything, you know, because it makes, to me, I think Eighth Blackbird is one, right, and Ice is one. They memorize, you know, it makes all the difference in the world. It's embodied. That said, if I've worked with big orchestras, you know, they can't do that. Right. I was lucky enough with my first orchestra piece, which was called A Possible Sky, and it was for Michael Tilson Thomas and the New World Symphony. He spent about 5 years trying to convince me to do it. It's like, no, I'm not. But he said, just think of the orchestra as your ensemble, Meredith. You know, just think of it as a big version of your ensemble. So what was wonderful about that process is I went down I think I spent about 2 years working on that. And I did just bring in material, and then we tried it. And I would go, and I think that Jackie will also talk about the ACJW when I worked on Blacklight, where I could work with her and find, okay, what are some things the flute could do with this particular line that would make it sound, you know, really unique. And I did that with a young instrumentalist at the New World Symphony. And then it was so exciting for the ones that were there through the whole process when we finally did play it, because they were in on the process. And I always feel that, instrumentalists as well, when they're in on the process, it's so exciting for them. When I wrote Atlas for the Houston Grand Opera, we had a wonderful group of instrumentalists down in Houston, and they had never had a composer say, you know, I said to the horn player, do you have a mute that would sound really good, like, you know, with this one section? He said, oh yes, Meredith. And, you know, and they were so involved that they'd be you'd see them in the pit. The people that weren't playing, they were leaning back against the pit, watching the piece almost every night, and the horn player a number of years ago came to me and visited me here in New York with tears in his eyes. He said, I'll never forget that experience working on Atlas as long as I live. It's just a chance for people to feel that their creativity is also something that's valuable in a world that usually, sort of denies that aspect of them.
I think so many musicians feel objectified.
Yes.
By having to serve a very clear black and white picture that's delivered to them.
As I said on Tuesday, notes are just little dots on the page, and they only are a code for an energy that's being conveyed. And as I said, many composers change their scores. That's part of the. It doesn't have to be fixed, but it's just in that tradition. It's difficult to do that. There are a lot of steps. It's like making a film. When I made a feature-length film, to recut that is, something to, it's quite a challenge. But I think that if there's a way that this oral tradition idea, which I feel much closer to, could just be incorporated into the, what we now are calling the classical music world, I think that there's something in that that's so valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm moved by the agency that you give your artists. That I think that's important right now, perhaps more than ever. There are a few questions that I want to make sure I get to. I'll definitely make time. And anybody out there, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A. I do want to talk about Indra's Net. Indra's Net was commissioned by, was it Mills?
Mm-hmm.
And it has yet to be premiered. It was slated to be premiered in October, November last year.
And it probably would have been finished too.
Right. Talk to us about that, and in particular, talk to us about the metaphor of Indra's Net, this Vedic idea.
Thank you. I'd love to talk about it. In the Hindu Buddhist tradition, there are stories that are called teaching stories that illustrate or convey a kind of spiritual principle, you could say. Indra's Net, the story of Indra's Net, the legend of Indra's Net is that Indra was an enlightened king, and he built a net that covered the whole universe. And at each intersection was a infinitely faceted jewel that would reflect all the other infinitely faceted jewels in the universe. So the principle is a principle of interdependence, and how each of us, every action that we do resonates in the world. So nothing that we do is just isolated. It always has a connection or a relation to other parts of the world. We influence people by our thinking, by our actions. So I just thought it was such a beautiful, first of all, such a beautiful story. And it was something I had been thinking about for a long time. And I just couldn't find it. Like when I was working on Weave for the St. Louis Symphony, I was going to call that Indra's Net, but it wasn't right. But just this thing of the connection of these realms. And so in Indra's Net, the first thing I started working on, I actually can show you my little notebook if you would like to see it.
Yes, please.
The first thing I started working on was the thing of the jewels. So, I did it in a very literal way, but the music is very abstract. And I don't usually work that way, with a very particular image. Now I'm going to work on the jewels. Now I'm going to work on the net. It never will work out well. But this somehow it just got me started. And then, the music took off on its own. So I think of those, the jewels are going to be purely instrumental. And they really are these almost like little rotating little forms, very, very intricate, delicate, woven forms that keep turning. So I can show you my very first page. I can't remember how many. This must have been around 2015. That was my first page of the jewels.
Huh.
My scribbling.
Oh, that's great to see.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So I started working with them and with the jewels, and just I think I made about 5 of them. and then just continued from there, working on material. So what it's going to really be like as far as these realms is, I think of a kind of and also visually, I think of the whole space almost like a sphere or a mandala, not only in, flat if you look down at the floor, but much more also in terms of low to high. And I was going to be working with, and I hope that I will continue to work with Meyer Sound in terms of speakers that will give you that sense of that the audience is in the midst of a kind of spherical reality, so that you get that vertical as well as horizontal kind of sense and circular. And so there, I think of a celestial kind of realm, which is definitely the jewels. And that also, I think, incorporates these two pieces that I think of as the connective tissue of the piece. One of them is Anthem, which you will be able to hear tomorrow night. And the other one is Rotation, which we're working on now. And those include instrumentalists, the singers, and maybe even a chorus that I'm calling the mirror chorus. So 8 other singers. And then then there are a lot of a cappella pieces that are much more earthy, and even pieces that feel like they're coming from inside the body, like almost from the microscopic realm. And so it's a kind of a balance of those realms. And then there are solos for each singer where you see each of their personalities like very strongly. So it's kind of creating this world.
Yeah, this interconnected piece.
Interconnected piece.
Lots of stuff, but at the same time, a central component is emptiness.
Well, I love that you said that in the question, because emptiness is something that I've been a Buddhist practitioner for many, many years, and emptiness, of course, is a loaded term, because emptiness, I think a lot of people are afraid of the word emptiness because they think it means void, but it actually means space, which is not really empty. But it's also, I think, something that, and listen, I'm just going blah, blah, blah. You should ask a teacher, not me, about all this. But I think that something that happened during the pandemic that was very interesting, that does relate to this idea of emptiness, is that everything that we thought we could hold on to that was real in our lives, and that we were putting a lot of attention on, suddenly all of that disappeared.
Yeah.
Like the rug was pulled out from underneath all the world,
Right.
in one way or another. And so what we thought was real, or an object in space or time, or, a performance, or all these things we thought were real, suddenly just disappeared. And I think that's something about emptiness, is that it's full and empty simultaneously. The table is here, but the table isn't here, at the same time. So it's a lifelong kind of, that concept of emptiness is something that I cannot speak about with, full authority. I think it's something that we can contemplate for our lives.
Did you try to represent this notion of emptiness?
No, not necessarily. I think InterDisciplinary really has much more to do with, if it doesn't really represent anything.
Yeah.
I feel like art doesn't really represent anything. Otherwise, it's illustration. It can, what would I say? It can evoke mysteries that we cannot talk about. It can evoke the nameless world. It can evoke energies for which we don't have words, and feelings for which we don't have words. But as far as representing, I don't think that's really good art, in my opinion. But I think it's more just evoking the sense of our interconnectedness is what the piece is about. And strangely enough, it does seem so relevant right now.
It sure does.
Yeah.
We have several questions, so I want to make some time for them here. This comes from Denise. Hello, just would like to add a comment and question. There seems to be a swelling of emotions coming forth. There seems to be a shift happening where people want to understand why they feel the way they do. I am seeing and sensing this within the online networks I am connected to confront the truth, take a risk. We need to come from a place of vulnerability, but also resiliency. I am curious if Meredith believes if we continue to confront the truth, take a risk, be vulnerable, will the world change, and change into what?
I think I live from that hope, or that belief that we all are, that there is basic goodness as the ground base of everything. And it's a beautiful question, because I think that vulnerability is one of the keys. Actually, what have we got to lose? I would say that's, and I think that's come up so much now in all of our thinking. What have we got to lose to be vulnerable? Really, there's nothing to hold on to. And it always was that way. And there was never anything to hold on to, but that was in the back of our awareness, and now it's up in the front of our awareness. So I would hope that these principles of keeping as open-hearted as possible, kindness, and vulnerability, if people just really make them be part of their individual lives, his or her individual lives, or their individual lives, I think that can only be a healing element in our world.
This comes from Morgan. Do you have any advice or recommendations for loosening musical processes or expectations, particularly to make space for simmering and reaching beyond what's conventionally quote unquote correct?
Well, I think there are all kinds of little techniques that you can play with in terms of your own process. You have to know your own process very well. But for example, you could consider going in and as a composer, and whatever your instrument is, say you sit at the piano to work, and you could say, okay, tonight I'm going to play as if it's automatic writing, and I'm just going to play. I'm just going to play. And if there's one little tiny note or phrase, or or like a fragment of a phrase, then maybe I'll keep that. But so that's one way of loosening up, not sitting down with the paper and the empty page, but going and playing for a while. For me, it's more, I think the playful aspect of making art is also very important. I mean, I think that art is very serious. There's a serious part to it, but, because you're taking responsibility to try to give something and devote yourself to giving something to other people that will be nourishing for them, and inspiring for them. So that's a responsibility. But I think the playfulness is also part of it, very much part of it. And that if you can also convey that as part of what it ends up being, it's also part of something that you can do that's very, very positive. So I think each person's got to find their own, what would I say, their own techniques of breaking down what they usually do, to just try to open it up, even if it doesn't work out in the way that they think. Nevertheless, it's still breaking through these habits.
It's
Is
lovely.
that helpful at all? I hope so.
I think it's really well put. And what makes me think of is, and this ties into something you talked about on Tuesday, when you mentioned the oral tradition. I think musicians in particular are constrained, or they don't, the oral tradition does not have so much value for many musicians, I think, especially trained musicians. I'm wondering what you think about, have we overemphasized this notion of musical literacy in terms of reading music on the page as opposed to feeling music?
I think about it a lot. I'm glad that I had piano when I was a child and that I can read, and nevertheless, I feel that, there's a wonderful book by Jamaki Highwater, which is called The Primal Mind, which I highly recommend. He wrote it many, many years ago. He came from a Native American background, but was brought up, I think he was an orphan, and was brought up by a white family in California. And he talks about how, for example, in music, now it's left the oral. The oral is not the dominant sense mechanism. It's more the visual in the Western European tradition. So it's changed from being something for the ear to something for the eye, and that something really got destroyed by that shift. And so I think that we really do have to go back to our bodies as the musical instruments, our bodies as the musical perceivers. And there's nothing to, I think it's, there's nothing wrong with knowing how to read, But I think if you get imprisoned by it and imprisoned by the conservatory, it's a sad thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know people that have gone to Juilliard that, you know, their music just sounds like Juilliard to me.
Yeah.
You know, and so I just keep on saying, could you just get rid of Juilliard? I want to find out what your music is. You know, you spend your whole life getting rid of what you learned because it's so rigid, you know. So I think that, you know, is there a way as teachers that we can teach those skills like reading and playing the instrument and everything? Again, I think this is where Dalcroze comes in, which is pretty amazing, because those children that learn Dalcroze, they do learn how to read, and they learn solfege and they learn technique, but at the same time, it's completely free. So, you know, it's, again, it has to do with what's the quality of listening. Sometimes that paper gets in the way of listening. And so, you know, and I want to try to also mention jazz musicians, you know, who are amazing readers and yet are finding their freedom at every moment of what they're doing. You know, what their work is about is immediacy. What their work is about is being so, what would I say, you know, it's so devoted to your instrument that you're spending all your time being so devoted to your instrument that at any moment you're ready to play and you're ready to create. It's a very different way. I used to talk about this with my dear friend, the late Colin Walcott, who was a wonderful, wonderful percussionist, and he began the group Oregon. And, you know, and he worked also a lot with Ravi Shankar. And so the Indian tradition is also that too, is that you get your chops up, you really get your chops up. You're spending all your time on that so that you are open for the inspiration of the moment. Even, and at the same time, there are forms like the raga form. You stay within that form, but the moment by moment, you have the resources to play in those moments and find creativity right in the moment. For myself, I love the building process, you know, so I don't think that I could do that, you know, be totally an improvisational musician. I love it very much, but the satisfaction for me is finding new forms. You know, that's what I love, like between the cracks, you know, I like to find the forms, but I just have so much respect for that. So I think, how could we say that jazz musicians are not literate? I think they're so advanced.
Yes.
You know, on every level, you know, in terms of playing scales, resources, harmony. I mean, everything, you know, there's so much to be learned from their expansive, you know, possibilities. So I think that's just a way of thinking about things. And in the academy, I think the teachers have just got to try to be more open to other possibilities, I would say.
Totally dig that. And I'll take this moment to admit that I did go to Juilliard. I went to Juilliard for 2 years, but then spent the next 20 years trying to purge Juilliard from my body.
Juilliard is wonderful. I mean, I'm not trying to put anything or anybody down.
Oh, I know that.
What you get in Juilliard is so great, but the only pain of it to me, and I've seen that also in other conservatories, is somehow the person is meant to feel unworthy.
That I agree with that. Let's get to this question from Andre, and I thank you for that answer. Listening to Meredith, I see her as a person that trusts in the process. Could you talk more about trusting in the process, how to cultivate it in a deeper way? And parenthetically, I'm very happy in taking part in this meeting. I'm from Brazil, and it's amazing to stay with you.
Favorite Brazil, beijo, Brazil. I love meu coração. Coração. Yeah, so it's a beautiful country. I love performing there so much. You know, I don't know if I generally can talk about process, because again, I feel that everybody's process is so different. And it takes so many years to actually understand how to trust your process. Yeah. I mean, you know, as a young artist, I feel like sometimes I would trust it and sometimes I wouldn't. And it would be I had a lot of anguish about that. I mean, I think it's really hard to trust yourself. You know, that's period. It's a lifelong journey and a lifelong task. I think maybe this thing about listening to your impulses. Listening to your impulses is the first beginning of trusting your process. And just working, see what works for you, see what doesn't work for you. Also, I want to say that failure sometimes is one of the best things that can happen to you. And I think every time and I've done dismal failures in my life, but it's painful, but I always learn a lot from it. So
Uh-oh, frozen just a little bit. I think we're having a little technical. Oh, Meredith, I lost you for a second.
That process was a fruitful process.
I think I got the gist. You did freeze a little bit, or maybe it was on my end, but
I think I did. Am I back?
You are, yeah. This question from Matthew: do you have plans to perform Indra's Net with a live audience post-pandemic?
Definitely. I'm just living for that. But meanwhile, trying to keep the material coming to life, so that when it's time that we can do that, then we will be ready. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would be so sad because, as I say, all the ideas are so much about relationships in space and relationships between the audience and the performers. It would be really sad to not fulfill that. So,
and do you know where it will be, or are you ready to divulge that? We have
different, we will do a form at Mills, but, because of the pandemic, probably we will do more what we're thinking about now is a concert, because we can't get out there. That's one of the problems, with the singers. And the room that we were going to be performing in is quite small. So, it's the singers are having the hardest time. And so one of the ideas that we've been playing around with is having the audience outside. And actually, this would be more like a recording kind of performance. It would not be a live performance because we can't be out there. But it would be played over these gigantic speakers outdoors. Because I was inspired by, I was on tour, I think it was in the 80s, and I think it was in Graz, Austria. It might have been Graz. Anyway, it was where the Bruckner Festival is. And they had the concert of the orchestral pieces in the big concert hall, but they had these big speakers all over the town where you could be walking by the river and hear the music.
Wow.
It was so great. And I thought, wow, that's probably what these 19th century orchestral composers really had in mind, in a way. And I just thought that was such a great thing. I've been thinking of it ever since. And so I was thinking, that would be so interesting for Indra's Net, that you'd be able to hear this music outdoors. And then we might do some video sections, like on a giant screen from time to time. And this would just be until we can do something like it live.
Right.
This would be, again, fulfilling the situation that we're all living in.
We're improvising through it.
Yeah.
This question from Denise: wow, musicians feel objectified like dancers do. Too much emphasis on getting the notes and the steps instead of an embodied creative collaboration. How did you, Meredith, arrive at this process when working with artists?
I think there was just a point where I realized that I didn't want to go into rehearsal and say, this is what you're going to do, period. Because, again, it cuts down on possibilities. And also, I think performers, when they are not treated that way, there's a different level of commitment that you feel it. It's not that you can put your finger on it exactly, but there's some kind of sense of ownership where the level of communication is much deeper than, when someone is given something. I mean, again, with full respect to people that spend their lives as interpreters and are given something, and then they do it beautifully and they find their own way. They go into the studio, because I mean, when I first came to New York, I was in people's pieces, and I went into the studio and found my own way within that material. And that was a wonderful thing too, and it's a very honorable life, really. How do you find your own way of doing something that's been given to you? as a finished piece. But I don't know, to me, it's something so transcendent when people are, when all the aspects of them are, are part of something. It's just so rich. And, I always laugh because when I'm working by myself, and this is not just only during the pandemic, when I'm making a piece of music, I usually lay tracks down myself with my own voice.
Yeah.
To work on my counterpoint, how the piece is going to be. And, because I'm singing all the tracks myself, my blend is perfect. It's like, it has a certain way that I get used to hearing. And then when I go into rehearsal and I, have somebody else sing it, it's like, ooh, it's kind of a shock. But then it's so beautiful though, because it's different. And then we work from there and see if there's more ways that we can play with it and change it and everything. So. Yeah, I love doing solos, and I do feel fully free as a person when I do solos. It's a kind of freedom that I can't get, I don't think anybody can get when they're working in a group piece, because a group piece is much different. In a group piece, you are free, and especially with a group like mine, we've been working together so long that we, and we're so sensitized to each other that we know, that's going to happen. At this moment, Katie's playing with that little piece of material. I hear it, and but it's within this form. So there is a lot of freedom. And the other thing that's really beautiful is that if somebody's having a hard night, we're all pulling for them.
Mm-hmm.
But the solo thing is a little different as a composer, because I can, as a soloist, sing my forms. Because if you listen to one of the two pieces that I'm going to be doing on Sunday, the form would be the same if you listen to a recording, but at any moment I have the freedom. If I'm finding something in that moment, it's like a tree. I'm going up the trunk, and then if I find this branch, I could maybe stay on that branch a little bit longer because I'm finding something new right in that moment, and then I go back to the trunk and I continue in the form. So that's a wonderful thing to do solo pieces.
Beautiful. I want to let everyone know that Friday from 2 to 3:30, there's a discussion and Q&A with the U of O Faculty Ensemble, Meredith Monk and Allison Sniffen, and that's on Backlight. That's Friday from 2 to 3:30. And on Sunday at 2 p.m. is a virtual concert with Katie Gessinger and Allison Sniffen. That's Sunday at 2 p.m. Meredith, this has been such a pleasure. I'm going to go make soup tonight.
Yay.
I am thrilled that we had this hour together. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody else that came in today.
And thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.